I was pouring coffee when my son dropped a spreadsheet on the table. I need $100,000 for the wedding, he said flatly. Silence hit the room. If you can't do it, let me know so we can adjust the guest list. My childhood note rested in my pocket. Dad, when I get married, remember to walk me down the aisle? 30 years later, the aisle had a price. Pay $100,000, or be erased from the wedding entirely. Every memory, every promise weighed against this single number. This story begins with silence, but ends with something you'll remember. Before we start, leave a quick comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone close to you? Just yes or no. Your answer might mean something to someone else reading. One note: certain details are fictionalized for impact. The lesson is what stays. The paper was yellow. With age, the handwriting wobbly with an 8-year-old's careful concentration. Dad, when I get married, remember to walk me down the aisle. I stood in my garage that Saturday morning, April sunlight slanting through the open door, and stared at words my son had written 27 years ago. The note had been tucked inside a small wooden box at the back of my workbench drawer, the drawer that always stuck, which I just yanked open, looking for a socket wrench. At 68, I looked like any other retired diesel mechanic in South Tacoma. Grease lived permanently under my fingernails. My flannel shirts hung in the closet in blues and greens, and one good red one I saved for church. The garage smelled like motor oil and old coffee. The memento box was barely bigger than my palm. Inside sat a baby tooth, a report card with all A's, and a dried corsage from Brandon's high school prom. I didn't remember putting it there. Probably shoved it in years ago when Eleanor was still alive, back when we kept every scrap of childhood evidence. I read the note again. The letters leaned right the way kids' handwriting does before teachers fix it. Brandon must have been 8, maybe 9. Young enough to think his father hung the moon. Young enough to make promises he meant. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my breast pocket. The phone rang. I wiped my hands and pulled it from my other pocket. Brandon's name lit up the screen. Dad, I'm bringing my girlfriend to meet you this afternoon. His voice had that brisk, executive tone he'd developed somewhere in his 30s. We'll be there around 2. I glanced at the kitchen clock, just past 10. That's wonderful, son. I'll be ready. He paused. Keep it simple, okay? Keep it simple. I looked around the garage at 20 years of simple tools on pegboard, the coffee maker with its cracked carafe, Mrs. Patterson's Honda, with its hood propped open. Of course, I said. The line went quiet. Then see you at 2, and he hung up. I finished the valve cover, started the Honda to check for leaks, then went inside to clean up. The house was small, paid off 30 years ago. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with original cabinets from 1975. Eleanor and I had bought it when Brandon was 3. She'd died 6 years ago, and I'd kept everything exactly the way she'd left it. I showered, scrubbing the grease, then stood in front of my closet. My newest flannel shirt was the red one, barely 2 years old. I put it on and checked my reflection. An old man looked back, gray hair, weathered face lines, earned from decades of work. How long had it been since my son looked at me without that thin layer of embarrassment in his eyes? I pushed the thought away and went to make coffee. At 5 minutes past 2, I heard the engine before I saw the car. A BMW dark blue, gleaming like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. It pulled into my driveway next to the decade-old pickup I'd bought used from a guy in Puyallup. Brandon Hayes stepped out first. 35 years old and sharply dressed in a way that screamed, "Trying too hard pressed?" Slacks, designer shoes, a watch that probably cost more than my mortgage used to. His hair was perfect. His posture was perfect. Everything about him looked like a man who'd spent money learning how to look like he hadn't. The passenger door opened and Chloe Bennett emerged. She was 30 with kind eyes and a nervous smile. She smoothed her dress and looked at my small house with what seemed like genuine warmth. Dad? Brandon walked up the path without quite meeting my eyes. This is Chloe. Chloe, this is my father. He's a retired diesel mechanic. Retired diesel mechanic. The words landed flat like a label on a jar. Chloe stepped forward, with her hand extended, her smile growing wider. It's so wonderful to finally meet you, Mr. Hayes. Brandon talks about you. I shook her hand. Call me Alvin. Come in, please. I made coffee. We sat in the living room for an hour. Chloe asked questions, real questions, not the polite kind you ask while waiting to leave. She wanted to know about the garage, about Eleanor, about how long I'd lived in Tacoma. Brandon sat beside her, checking his phone twice, contributing only when directly addressed. The smile on Chloe's face was real. The silence in my son's eyes was real too. When they stood to leave, Chloe hugged me at the door. Thank you so much for having us. I hope we can do this again soon. Anytime, I said, and meant it. Brandon walked her to the car, opened her door, waited until she was inside. Then he came back up the path, stopped close to me, leaned in so his voice wouldn't carry. Dad, he whispered, don't wear a flannel shirt next time. The words hung in the air between us. Don't wear flannel next time, as if the clothes that had raised him, fed him, kept the lights on for 35 years, were suddenly something to be ashamed of. The fabric that had absorbed his skinned knee tears and his graduation hugs was now evidence of something lesser, something embarrassing, something that needed to be hidden when company came. I looked at my son. The note in my breast pocket felt suddenly heavy. I nodded. I said nothing. Brandon turned and walked back to his gleaming BMW. The engine started with a purr I'd probably rebuilt 100 times in my career. Chloe waved from the passenger window as they pulled away. I stood in my driveway in my 2-year-old flannel shirt and watched my son disappear down the street. 2 weeks passed before I saw them again. The restaurant Gregory chose for our first family dinner was perfect, expensive enough to prove he had standards, affordable enough that I wouldn't feel out of place, and exactly the kind of calculation that should have warned me what was coming. Gregory Bennett met me at the entrance with an extended hand and practiced warmth. 62 years old, with silver hair and the smooth smile of a man who'd spent decades selling things people didn't need. Alvin. So wonderful to finally meet Brandon's father. Vivian Bennett stood beside him, 58, and dressed in carefully curated casual elegance, the kind of outfit that cost more than it looked like it cost. She smiled at me with warmth that never reached her eyes. We've been so looking forward to this. Brandon and Chloe were already seated inside. I'd driven up from Tacoma in my pickup, changed into khakis and a button-down shirt, not flannel, and arrived exactly on time. The restaurant was in Bellevue, all dark wood and soft lighting. The kind of place where the prices aren't printed on the menu and the portions are small enough to be called artistic. We ordered. Gregory selected an expensive bottle of wine without asking anyone's preference. The conversation started pleasant enough, weather, traffic, Brandon's work at the consulting firm. Then Gregory leaned back in his chair and smiled at me. So Alvin, Brandon mentioned you're in South Tacoma. That area has such character. How long have you lived there? Character. The word hung in the air like a question mark, shaped like an insult. 43 years, I said. Bought the house when my wife Eleanor and I were young. How authentic, Vivian said, reaching for her wine. There's something so precious about the honesty of working-class people. It's refreshing in our circles, isn't it, Gregory? Precious, honest, working class. Each word delivered with a smile, each one a small cut disguised as a compliment. Brandon stared at his plate. Chloe glanced between her mother and me, confusion flickering across her face, but she didn't speak. And you were a diesel mechanic, Gregory continued. That must have been steady work. Steady. Not successful, not fulfilling. Steady. It was honest work, I said, borrowing Vivian's word and handing it back to her. Kept the lights on, put Brandon through college. Oh, we know all about the sacrifices parents make, Vivian said, touching Gregory's hand. We've given Chloe every opportunity. Private schools study abroad the right connections. It's so important to invest in your children's future. The implications sat on the table between the appetizers and the breadbasket they had invested properly. I had not. You can learn everything you need to know about people in the first 10 minutes, if you're willing to stay quiet and let them show you. I appreciate you making time to meet, I said. Brandon's told us wonderful things about your family. Gregory smiled. Well, family is everything. And now that our children are getting serious, it's important we all understand each other. Shared values, shared expectations. You understand. Shared values. Code for do you belong in our world? The dinner lasted 2 hours. Gregory asked about my neighborhood, my income, my retirement plans. Each question wrapped in concern but weighted with something else. Calculation, assessment. Vivian mentioned their country club membership twice, their vacation home in San Juan Islands, 3 times their charitable board positions, often enough that I lost count. Brandon never once defended me, never redirected a question or softened an implication. He sat there, my son, and let them dissect his father like a specimen under glass. Chloe tried once. Dad, Mr. Hayes probably doesn't want to talk about nonsense. Gregory cut her off. We're all family here. No secrets among family, right, Alvin? I smiled. I nodded. I memorized every word. When the check came, Gregory made a show of grabbing it before I could reach for my wallet. Please, my treat. We invited you to our part of town after all. Our part of town. We said our goodbyes in the parking lot. Chloe hugged me again. Brandon shook my hand. Gregory and Vivian smiled their cold, perfect smiles, and promised we'd do this again soon. I drove home to Tacoma and the dark windows down, letting the cool April air clear my head. The childhood note was still in my wallet, transferred from the flannel shirt I hadn't worn. When I got married, remember to walk me down the aisle. The boy who wrote that wouldn't have recognized the man who sat silent at dinner tonight. What I didn't know until much later was what happened after Gregory got home that night. His office wasn't the study of a wealthy man, it was the bunker of a desperate one. He sat in the dark desk lamp, the only light, and pulled up spreadsheets he'd memorized by heart. $9 million in debt, $3 million to the IRS from a tax shelter that had collapsed spectacularly, $4 million spread across 3 banks whose patience was measured in quarterly reviews, $2 million to private investors whose patience was measured in threats. The vacation home Vivian had mentioned 3 times, second mortgage underwater. The country club paid with a credit card he was juggling between balance transfer offers. The charitable board positions, the last acceptable mask before the whole thing came apart. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd gotten from a business associate who understood discretion. The man who answered didn't waste time on pleasantries. What do you need? Background investigation, Gregory said. Complete financial workup. I need to know assets, debts, income sources, property holdings, everything. Subject: Alvin Hayes, South Tacoma, retired mechanic. He pulled up the notes he'd been taking during dinner observations, logged like surveillance data. Timeline: 2 weeks, sooner if possible. The line went quiet for a moment. Then in the budget for this investigation, Gregory stared at the spreadsheet showing his own financial collapse, at the numbers that woke him at 3 in the morning, at the reality that his daughter was about to marry into a family he needed to either extract value from or prevent her from joining. No limit, he said. I need to know everything he has. He hung up and leaned back in his chair, phone still warm in his hand, staring at the evidence of his own desperation, as if throwing money he didn't have at an investigation would somehow solve the problem of having no money to throw. Gregory's investigation took time. So did what came next. They say you can get used to anything if it happens slowly enough, a degree at a time, an insult at a time, a dinner at a time. The second dinner happened in May at a waterfront restaurant in Seattle. Vivian commented on my shirt within 5 minutes of sitting down. Your flannel is so rustic, she said, touching the fabric like she was examining an artifact, like something preserved in a heritage museum. Chloe frowned. Mom, I mean it as a compliment, darling, Vivian said, her smile never wavering. Authenticity is so rare these days. Brandon said nothing. He was cutting his steak with surgical precision, eyes fixed on his plate. The third dinner was in June at the Bennett home in Bellevue Estates. Their house was exactly what you'd expect. Too big, too clean, too carefully staged to look casual. Gregory walked me through the first floor like a museum guide, pointing out the art they'd collected, the furniture they'd imported, the renovations that had cost more than my house was worth. We believe in investing in quality, he said, standing in front of a painting I didn't recognize. Things that hold their value. Things, not people. Things. The fourth dinner came in July. Gregory leaned back in his chair at a steakhouse in Bellevue and studied me over his wine glass. Manual labor has its own nobility, he said. Society needs capable people at every level. Someone has to keep the machinery running. Right, every level. He made it sound like a kindness, instead of what it was, a hierarchy with me at the bottom and him at the top. Brandon checked his phone. Chloe shifted in her seat, uncomfortable but silent. August brought dinner number 5. Vivian looked around the restaurant, white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, prices that required a second mortgage, and leaned toward me with concern painted on her face. "You must feel so out of place in restaurants like this," she said. "So brave of you to keep coming." Brave, as if being in their world required courage instead of just tolerance. By September, Brandon sat 3 feet farther from me than he had in April. The distance grew at every dinner physical space, matching the emotional gulf that had opened between us. He never defended me, never interrupted when Gregory probed about my finances or Vivian delivered her surgical compliments. He just sat there, becoming more of a Bennett and less of a Hayes with every passing month. Chloe's discomfort had grown too. She'd started touching my arm when her parents spoke little gestures of solidarity she probably didn't realize she was making. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt it. Why did I sit through 5 months of polite humiliation because patient people see things that angry people miss? After each dinner, I drove home to my small house in Tacoma. I'd sit in Eleanor's chair by the window, the one she'd read in for 30 years, and I'd go over every conversation in my head. Not from pain, from precision. Every insult documented, every calculation observed, every word memorized. Eleanor's picture sat on the side table, her graduation photo from the community college where we'd met. 46 years ago, she'd understood patience better than anyone. "The truth always comes out," she used to say. "You just have to wait for the right time to let it." I was waiting. What I knew but Gregory didn't was what happened in late September when the investigation he'd commissioned finally produced results. Wade Kirby arrived at the Bennett house on a Tuesday evening. He was a private investigator in his 40s, with the kind of unremarkable face that made him excellent at his job. People forgot him 5 minutes after meeting him, which meant they talked freely around him and never saw him coming. He carried a leather portfolio containing 5 months of work. Gregory met him in the home office, door closed, whiskey poured. Subject's visible assets total approximately $10 million. Wade said, sliding documents across the desk. "Property holdings, modest investment portfolio, nothing exotic. He's careful, conservative. Everything's clean." Gregory studied the numbers, his expression cycling through disappointment, and then calculation. 10 million. Not as much as I'd hoped, but more than enough to work with. "He lives well below his means," Wade continued. "The house in Tacoma is paid off, worth maybe $400,000. The rest is in bonds and index funds. Very boring." "Boring means accessible," Gregory said. He leaned back, already planning. 10 million wasn't the fortune he'd imagined, but it was enough. Enough to solve his immediate problems. Enough to buy time with the investors whose patience was running out. Enough to matter. What Gregory didn't see was the second phone call Wade made 15 minutes later. I was in my garage when my phone buzzed. Wade's number. "Sir," he said, "I've delivered the numbers you wanted me to give him. He believes it completely." I set down the wrench I'd been holding. His reaction? Calculating. Relieved. "He thinks 10 million is enough to work with. He'll move soon." "Good," I said. Wade had worked security for Coastal Logistics for 12 years before going private. When Gregory's business associate had recommended him, Wade had called me first. That conversation had lasted 3 minutes. The plan we'd built had taken 5 months to execute. Every asset Gregory thought he'd discovered I'd meant for him to find. Every document Wade had shown him I'd approved. Every number in that portfolio was exactly what I wanted Gregory to believe. 10 million? Enough to look appealing. Enough to make him think he'd found something valuable. Not so much that it would seem impossible or suspicious. The real number was 30 times larger, but Gregory would never see that. He'd only see the bait. "He'll approach Brandon within the week," Wade said. Probably pitch some kind of partnership or investment opportunity. Let me know when he does, I said and ended the call. I stood in my garage, the same garage where I'd found Brandon's note 6 months ago, and I thought about patience, about Eleanor's wisdom, about the difference between reacting and planning. Gregory thought he was hunting. He had no idea he was already in the trap. The bait was set. Now I waited to see who would bite. There's a moment in every betrayal when you have the chance to say no, when you could still walk away, still choose differently, still be someone your father might recognize. That moment came for my son 1 week after Gregory received Wade's carefully constructed report. I didn't witness it myself. I learned about it later, every detail confirmed by people Gregory thought he could trust. But I'll tell it the way it happened, because this was the moment I lost my son not to death or distance, but to greed. Gregory chose a coffee shop in Capitol Hill for the meeting, neutral territory, independent place with good espresso and private corners where businessmen made deals they didn't want overheard. Brandon arrived 5 minutes late wearing the suit that had probably cost more than my monthly pension. They ordered. They exchanged pleasantries about Chloe, about wedding plans, about the weather. Then Gregory leaned forward. I want to talk to you about something delicate, he said. Something that could benefit both our families. Brandon stirred his coffee and waited. Your father has approximately $10 million in assets. Gregory continued sliding a single summary page across the table. Wade's work, my numbers, the trap opening its jaws. Property investments, conservative portfolio. After the wedding, with the right approach, we could secure a significant portion for the family's benefit. This was the moment, the fork in the road, the chance to stand up, walk out, choose his father over money. Brandon studied the paper for 30 seconds. Then he looked up and asked, what percentage is mine? Not, how do you know this? Not that's my father's money, not this feels wrong, just what percentage is mine? Gregory smiled. I was thinking 60-40. I'm providing the legal structure, the expertise, the connections. You're providing access. 40% isn't enough, Brandon said. He leaned back, and Wade's observer, a waitress who'd worked for Coastal Logistics for 6 years before taking this job, said later that Brandon looked relaxed, comfortable, like he'd been waiting for this conversation. I'm the one taking the risk. My relationship with him? 45 or I walk. Gregory pretended to consider. He tapped his fingers on the table. He frowned like a man weighing difficult options. Finally, he extended his hand. 45. But you handle the direct approach. I'll structure everything behind the scenes. They shook on it. My son shook hands on a deal to steal from his father. Not because he was desperate. Not because he was manipulated. Because he wanted more. That question, what percentage is mine, told me everything I needed to know about the man my son had become. When Wade's contact sent me the recording that night, I sat in my garage and listened to it 3 times. I thought maybe I'd misheard. Maybe there was context I was missing. Maybe Brandon had played along to gather evidence, planning to warn me later. But no, the recording was clear. The greed was clear. The calculation in his voice was clear. I saved the file on 3 different devices. Evidence for later. What I didn't know then was that something else happened that same week. Something that would change the shape of everything that came after. Chloe came home late on Thursday night. She'd been at her apartment in Seattle packing boxes for the move into the place she and Brandon had rented together. She'd forgotten her tablet at her parents' house in Bellevue, needed it for work, drove out to grab it. She used her key quietly, knowing it was past 11. The house was dark except for light spilling from the kitchen. She heard her mother's voice, but not the voice she knew. Vivian stood at the kitchen island phone, pressed to her ear, speaking in a tone Chloe had never heard before. Cold, precise, sharp as cut glass. It's important to do it before signing the marriage contract, Vivian said. Get everything in place first. The girl doesn't need to know until after everything's secure. Chloe froze in the hallway. The girl. Which girl? No, she's completely unaware, Vivian continued. Trusting, sweet, perfect for what we need. Just keep her focused on wedding planning while we handle the real business. Chloe took 1 step forward. The floorboard creaked. The human face can change faster than you think, cold to warm in less than a heartbeat. Calculation to love in a single breath. Vivian turned, saw her daughter, and transformed. The sharp edges melted into maternal softness. The calculating eyes filled with warmth. The tight mouth spread into a delighted smile. The whole performance took maybe 2 seconds. "Oh, sweetheart," Vivian said, voice pitched high with surprise and affection. "You're home. I was just coordinating some surprise wedding details with the planner. You know how secretive these things have to be." She gestured at the phone like it was evidence of innocence instead of guilt. Chloe's mind raced. She could confront this. She could ask questions. She could demand to know what she'd really heard. Or she could pretend. "I just walked in," she said, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass in her throat. "I didn't hear anything. I came to grab my tablet. I'm exhausted, heading straight to bed." "Of course, darling. It's in your room where you left it." Chloe climbed the stairs, feeling her mother's eyes on her back. She grabbed the tablet. She said good night. She drove back to Seattle in complete silence, not even turning on the radio. Later, I would learn she'd called Brandon when she got home. Asked where he'd been that day. He'd said, "Work, just work, boring meetings." She'd asked if everything was okay. He'd said, "Fine, why wouldn't it be?" She'd said nothing about her mother's voice. Nothing about the phone call. Nothing about the cold calculation she'd heard. She lay in the dark that night, phone screen glowing with her engagement photo. Her and Brandon on the beach at sunset, both of them smiling. Both of them looking like people who hadn't yet learned who they were marrying into. She replayed those 3 words over and over. The girl doesn't need to know. Which girl? Know what? And why did her mother's real voice sound nothing like the one Chloe had heard her entire life? While Chloe lay awake asking questions she wasn't ready to answer, October arrived, and my brother Russell finally asked the one I couldn't avoid. Russell Hayes had a way of asking questions that weren't really questions, they were mirrors held up to show you what you'd already decided, but hadn't admitted yet. He called me on a Saturday morning. "Come over for coffee," he said. Not an invitation, a summons. Russell lived 3 houses down in South Tacoma. He was 72, with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much, including burying his own son 20 years ago in a car accident that still hung between us. He'd helped raise Brandon after Eleanor died, stepping in when I couldn't see past my grief. He had the right to ask hard questions. I walked over just after 9. Russell sat on his back porch, 2 mugs of coffee already waiting. From his porch you could see my garage across the fence line, the place where I'd taught Brandon to change oil, where we'd rebuilt engines together, where he'd told me about his dreams. Russell handed me coffee and didn't speak for a full minute. "Then what do you know, Alvin? And don't tell me nothing. I raised your son for 10 years. I know when something's breaking." I drank the coffee buying time. Russell had always known more than he let on. "Brandon's getting married," I said. "I know that. What else?" "Her family is particular. Gregory and Vivian Bennett. Bellevue money people, or the appearance of it." Russell nodded. "How do they treat you?" "Like I'm the help." "How does Brandon respond?" I stared at my coffee. That was the question that hurt most. "He doesn't," I said. 6 months of dinners. 6 months of them dissecting me. 6 months of him sitting there silent, letting it happen. Getting quieter each time. "And you've been quiet too." "Yes." "Why?" Russell's eyes were patient but uncompromising. He wanted the real answer. "Because I wanted to see how far it would go," I said. "How much he'd tolerate. How deep the rot ran. And deep enough that he's negotiating percentages." Russell's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Percentages of what?" "Me. My assets. Gregory hired an investigator. Found what I let him find. Now he and Brandon have a partnership. 45% for Brandon. That's what his father's worth to him." The words sat between us like stones. What's the difference between teaching someone and losing them? Sometimes it's everything. Sometimes it's nothing at all. Russell set down his coffee and leaned back. "So you've been running a counter-investigation?" "Yes. You know exactly what they're planning. Every detail. And you've been letting it happen. Letting them reveal themselves," I said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Russell's voice was gentle, but the question landed hard. Because from where I sit, it looks like you're building a case instead of saving a son. I didn't answer. Russell stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at my garage at the neighborhood where we'd both raised our boys, where his son had died, and mine had drifted into someone I didn't recognize. I need to ask you something, Alvin, and I need you to answer honestly. Not to me, to yourself. I waited. Do you want to teach Brandon a lesson or lose him forever? Because those two things aren't always the same thing. The question hung in the cold morning air. A crow called from somewhere in the trees. Normal sounds in a world that felt anything but normal. I don't know, I said, and the honesty surprised me. 6 months of strategic patience, 6 months of controlled observation, and I still didn't know the answer to the only question that mattered. What I want, I continued, is for my son to realize what he's becoming before it's too late. I want him to choose differently. And if he doesn't, then I want him to understand consequences. Russell turned to face me. His weathered face showed every one of his 72 years. Russell had buried his son. He knew what it meant to lose a child, in ways I couldn't imagine, permanent, irrevocable, final. What I was facing wasn't death, but distance. Betrayal. The slow murder of relationship. Consequences and punishment aren't the same thing, Russell said. One teaches, the other destroys. And once you start down that road, Alvin, you can't put it back in the box. You can't unsay words. You can't undo revelations. I looked at my garage again, the place where Brandon had learned to work with his hands, where I'd taught him that honest work, had dignity that you measured twice and cut once because mistakes cost time you couldn't get back. I haven't decided anything yet, I said. Russell studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Then make sure before you do it, he said quietly, because I loved you enough to raise your son when you couldn't. But I won't watch you destroy him because you couldn't forgive him. The words hit like a punch, not because they were cruel, because they were true. We finished our coffee in silence. When the mugs were empty, I stood to leave. Russell walked me to the edge of his porch, hand on my shoulder, for just a moment. Whatever you decide, he said, I'm here. But decide consciously, Alvin. Don't let anger choose for you. I walked home across our adjoining yards, Russell's question following me like a shadow. Teach or lose lesson, or son truth, or family. I looked at my garage, the place where I'd raised Brandon, taught him to change oil, listened to his childhood dreams about being an engineer, about making his father proud, about walking down an aisle someday. The childhood note was still in my wallet, the promise he'd written at 8 years old, the words that felt like they'd been written by a different person entirely. I still didn't have an answer, but time was running out to find one. Because while I was wrestling with philosophy on Russell's porch, Gregory Bennett was drafting the legal documents that would force my hand. Russell's question followed me home, but Gregory Bennett wasn't a man who asked questions. He built answers out of contracts and signatures. While I was still wrestling with the choice between teaching and losing, Gregory had already moved past questions into action, and the first weapon he built was made of paper and signatures. I learned about it later through sources Gregory never knew I had. Late October, he walked into Crawford & Associates in downtown Bellevue. The office was the kind that charged by the hour in 15-minute increments and had leather chairs that smelled like money. Daniel Crawford was a corporate attorney in his 50s who specialized in family wealth transfers. He'd learned not to ask too many questions when clients like Gregory Bennett paid premium rates for questionable paperwork. Gregory sat across from Crawford's mahogany desk and laid out exactly what he wanted. I need a post-marriage partnership agreement, he said. Brandon Hayes named as shareholder in his father's assets with me, serving as financial advisor and asset manager. Crawford made notes on his legal pad. Asset transfer structure. Gradual. Nothing that triggers immediate scrutiny. We establish the partnership, get the father's signature, while everyone's celebrating the wedding, then execute the transfers over 6 months. And the consideration, what does the father receive? Family unity. The joy of supporting his son's new life. Gregory's voice was flat transactional. Make it sound generous. Emphasize how he's helping Brandon start his marriage on solid financial footing. Crawford set down his pen. Mr. Bennett, this structure could face challenges. The power dynamics, the timing around marriage. These are vulnerability points if the arrangement is ever contested. Old people trust their son, Gregory said. That's their weakness. Make it legally sound enough to hold until we've moved the assets. After that, contestation doesn't matter. Crawford nodded slowly and picked up his pen. He'd been paid to draft documents, not provide moral guidance. When do you want this ready? 2 weeks before the wedding. I want Brandon to present it when his father's happiest. Right before the ceremony, when he's thinking about walking his son down the aisle, when he's emotional and grateful, and least likely to read the fine print. The timing wasn't accidental. It was psychological warfare disguised as celebration. Trust isn't a weakness, but believing someone won't weaponize your trust against you, that's the weakness Gregory was counting on. While Gregory was building his trap, I was trying to maintain the routine of a father whose son still called him back. I phoned Brandon 3 times a week through October and early November. He answered once. Dad, I'm really busy right now. Can this wait? Just wanted to hear your voice, I said. I'll call you back this weekend. He didn't. The second week of November, I drove to Seattle. I hadn't been invited, hadn't called ahead. I just needed to see my son, even if he didn't want to see me. Cascade Tower rose 37 stories above Pike Place Market, all glass and steel and expensive views. The lobby had a doorman who asked my business. I said I was visiting my son 8th floor. He checked a list and waved me through. Brandon answered the door in gym clothes, AirPods, still in his ears. When he saw me, his face cycled through surprise, annoyance, and finally forced politeness. Dad? He pulled out one earbud. You should have called first. I have plans in an hour. I was in the neighborhood. I lied. Thought I'd stop by. He didn't invite me in immediately. Just stood there, hand on the doorframe, body language, screaming that I was intruding. Finally, he stepped aside. 5 minutes. I really do have to get ready. The apartment was expensive in the way young professionals thought. Expensive looked minimalist furniture, abstract art, floor-to-ceiling windows with water views. Everything pristine, nothing personal. No photos of us, no childhood memories. Just a showcase of success. Nice place, I said. It's close to work, convenient. What's the address again? I want to make sure I have it right. 847 Cascade Tower. Why, just updating my address book. We talked for exactly 5 minutes. Weather, work, surface pleasantries that said nothing. Then Brandon checked his watch. Expensive probably cost more than my mortgage payment, and stood up. Dad, I really need to get going. I stood. Of course, don't let me keep you. He walked me to the door. No hug, barely a handshake. Thanks for stopping by. I drove back to Tacoma and went straight to my office. Not the garage. My real office, the one Brandon didn't know about, on the 14th floor of the Coastal Logistics headquarters building downtown. I pulled up the rental property database, searched for Cascade Tower. Our company had acquired the building 6 years ago as part of a mixed-use development portfolio. 37 floors, 212 units, 94% occupancy. I scrolled to unit 847. Tenant Brandon Hayes. Monthly rent $3,200. Lease term 2 years renewed annually. Property manager, Coastal Logistics Residential Division. I signed the rent form with the same pen I'd used to sign his birth certificate 35 years ago. Every month, Brandon's rent check probably set up as an automatic payment. He never thought about flowed through 3 levels of accounting before landing in a report that crossed my desk. He'd been living in my building for 4 years. 4 years of thinking he was independent, self-made, free from his working-class father's shadow. 4 years of me signing off on his rent, watching the payments process, never saying a word. I closed the file and sat in my office as the afternoon light faded over Tacoma's industrial waterfront. The port cranes looked like skeletal giants in the distance, loading and unloading the containers that had built the fortune my son didn't know existed. Brandon thought he was building his own life, independent and self-made, in that glass tower overlooking Elliott Bay. He had no idea every month's rent check flowed through accounting systems that reported directly to the father he was planning to rob. The ecosystem he lived in, worked in, moved through, all of it belonged to the man whose loneliness he'd dismissed as weakness. I picked up my phone. Wade Kirby answered on the second ring. He's living in one of ours, I said. I know, Wade replied. I've known since you asked me to take Gregory's case. Thought you'd figure it out eventually. Does he know? Not unless he reads his lease fine print more carefully than 99% of renters. I ended the call and looked out at the city I'd built a life in, the city my son lived in thinking he'd escaped. Brandon lived in my building, worked for companies in my supply chain, moved through an ecosystem I'd built over 40 years, and he had no idea. But while I was discovering the irony of my son's independence, other pieces were moving on the board, pieces I wouldn't learn about until later when everything had already been set in motion. Sometimes the most dangerous answers aren't the lies, they're the truths that have been rehearsed so perfectly they sound like lies. Mid-November, Chloe Bennett woke up in her childhood bedroom with the question she'd been avoiding for 6 weeks, burning in her chest. The question about her mother's voice, about the cold calculation she'd heard on the phone, about who her parents really were. She found Vivian in the kitchen making coffee. Morning light streamed through the windows of the Bellevue Estates house, illuminating marble countertops and European appliances and the careful staging of wealth. Chloe poured herself coffee and tried to sound casual. Mom, can I ask you something? Vivian looked up with immediate maternal warmth. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? Do you really like Brandon's father? The question hung in the air for exactly 1 second. Then Vivian smiled, not too quickly, not too slowly, perfectly calibrated, and her answer flowed like water. Of course, sweetheart. He's a good, honest man. We're lucky to have him joining our family. His values, his work ethic. Those are the kinds of qualities that matter more than money or status. Your father and I have always believed that. The words were perfect. Too perfect. No hesitation, no pause to consider, no stumbling over phrasing, just smooth practice perfection. Chloe felt something cold settle in her stomach. Right, she said. Thanks, Mom. She turned away before Vivian could see her face, before the doubt could show, before the question could become an accusation. She walked back to her room and sat on her bed, replaying the exchange in her head. Innocent people stumble over their words. Guilty people have had time to practice. Vivian had known the question was coming, had prepared for it, had rehearsed that exact response, the warmth, the phrasing, the emphasis on values and work ethic. She'd been ready because she knew her behavior had been questionable enough to warrant suspicion, and that readiness, that perfection, was proof. Chloe picked up her phone and stared at Brandon's name in her contacts. She could call him. She could ask what was really happening. She could demand the truth. But she wasn't ready yet. Not for the answers she was afraid she'd find. So she put the phone down and went to work, carrying the weight of unanswered questions like stones in her pockets. I learned about that conversation months later from Chloe herself, when everything had fallen apart, and the truth was the only thing left worth trading. But what happened the same week in Gregory's office that I learned about much sooner? Wade had connections everywhere, including in Crawford's firm, a paralegal who'd worked on Brandon's document, notes taken during meetings, recordings made when lawyers thought they were alone. Late November, Gregory called Brandon to his home office, said he had something important to discuss, something that would benefit them both. Brandon arrived at 7 in the evening after work, still in his suit. Gregory's office smelled like leather and expensive whiskey, the kind of room designed to make people feel simultaneously welcomed and outmatched. Brandon, sit, Gregory said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I have something for you. He slid a document across the mahogany surface. 20 pages dense legal text, formatted with the kind of professional precision that made it look official and important and trustworthy. This is a post-marital business partnership agreement, Gregory explained. Protects our shared family assets, ensures smooth financial coordination after the wedding. Standard practice in families like ours. Brandon picked up the document and scanned the first page. Words like fiduciary coordination, estate planning, asset management. The language was thick, impenetrable, designed to obscure rather than clarify. Eat shared assets, Brandon said slowly. What does that cover exactly? Standard language. Gregory assured him, his voice smooth as oil. Your father's estate are business interests. Simple coordination to make sure everything flows smoothly. Nothing you need to worry about. Crawford drafted it. Everything's legally sound. Brandon flipped through the pages. He didn't understand half of what he was reading. Beneficial interest, promissory consideration, liability provisions. The words swam together like alphabet soup. He could ask what it all meant, could admit he didn't understand, could ask for time to have his own lawyer review it, but that would make him look stupid, unsophisticated, like the working-class son of a mechanic who didn't belong in rooms like this making deals like this with men like Gregory Bennett. How many times has pride been the signature on a document that destroys us? "Where do I sign?" Brandon asked. Gregory smiled and pointed to 3 places marked with yellow tabs. Brandon signed all 3 without reading the clauses above them. The pen was heavy, expensive, the kind that cost more than a week's groceries. When he finished, Gregory stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to the family, son. This is going to be good for everyone." Brandon shook his future father-in-law's hand, feeling something like triumph, like he'd crossed a threshold into a world he'd always wanted to belong to, like he'd finally proven he was more than his father's son. He left the office carrying his copy of the agreement, planning to file it somewhere safe without reading it. Daniel Crawford had been standing in the corner of the office, silent and observant, playing his role as legal witness. After Brandon's footsteps faded down the hall, he stepped forward and leaned close to Gregory. Crawford paused. Technically, he could contest it, but any attorney would tell him the same thing the moment he admits he knew he was targeting his father's assets. He loses every good faith argument he has. The scheme makes the contract stick. Gregory picked up his whiskey glass and looked at the document on his desk. His pride signed it. That's all I needed. Brandon walked out of that office believing he'd signed a partnership agreement that would make him rich, that would cement his place in a family that valued him, that would finally separate him from the father whose flannel shirts embarrassed him. What he'd actually signed was a promissory note, making him personally liable for $1.5 million to a man drowning in $9 million of debt. The trap had closed around both father and son, one emotional, one legal, both designed by the same desperate hand, and the wedding was only 5 weeks away. Brandon had signed a promissory note he didn't understand. The wedding was 5 weeks away, and I still hadn't decided what to do. Then my son made the decision for me. There are moments in life when you can pinpoint the exact second a relationship dies, not with violence or noise, but with a number written on a piece of paper, and the coldness in your son's eyes when he delivers it. Late November, Tuesday afternoon, Brandon's car pulled into my driveway. I wasn't expecting him. He didn't call ahead anymore. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he knocked. Not the casual knock of someone coming home, but the formal knock of someone visiting a stranger. "Brandon," I said, opening the door. "Come in." He stepped inside, but didn't sit. Just stood in the kitchen where Eleanor had taught him to make pancakes, where we'd celebrated birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays that felt like everything. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket and placed it on the table. "I need you to contribute $100,000 to the wedding," he said. No greeting, no small talk. "That's your share as father of the groom." I looked at the paper. A spreadsheet. Line items for venue, catering, flowers, photography. Professional. Impersonal. At the bottom, a total that probably cost more than this house. "That's a lot of money," I said. "It's what's expected." His voice was flat. "Gregory's family is covering the rest, but you need to contribute your portion." I sat down at the table where he'd done homework while I made dinner. "What if I don't have that kind of money?" I asked. Brandon's expression didn't change. "Then you'd better not come. This isn't some small party in your old neighborhood dad. This is a real wedding. My wedding. Your old neighborhood. The neighborhood where I'd raised him. Now something to be ashamed of." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the note. The one I'd been carrying for 8 months. His 8-year-old handwriting, the careful letters that leaned right. "You wrote me something once," I said, unfolding it, "about walking you down the aisle. When I get married, remember to walk me down the aisle." Brandon glanced at the note. Something flickered across his face. Not regret, not nostalgia, just irritation at an inconvenient reminder. I promised when I was 8, Dad. Everything has changed. Everything has changed. 4 words that erase 35 years. 4 words that replace the child who'd loved me with this stranger who measured relationships in dollars. He picked up the paper and slid it closer. I need your answer by Friday. If you can't do it, let me know so we can adjust the guest list. Adjust the guest list. Code for remove you. This is my wedding, he added, heading toward the door. It's supposed to be the most important day of my life. I need to know you won't ruin it by showing up in flannel or saying something that embarrasses us in front of Gregory's business associates. He left. The door closed with a quiet click. I took the 8-year-old's note from my pocket and placed it on the table where Brandon had laid his invoice. One promised love, one demanded money. They were written by the same hand, 30 years apart. I sat there until the coffee went cold. The next morning I went to my real office, the 14th floor of Coastal Logistics headquarters in Seattle, the building Brandon didn't know I owned. Ray Coleman was waiting outside my door. He was head of security for Coastal Logistics, a former Seattle police detective who'd worked for me for 15 years. He'd learned that sometimes the most important information came from routine surveillance of corporate properties. Sir, he said, holding a small recording device. One of our employees was working nearby that day. Recognized Brandon, stayed close, wrote down everything he heard. I thought you should read it. He placed a typed transcript on my desk and I read it. The audio was clear. Background noise of a coffee shop espresso machine, his conversation murmur. Then Gregory's voice and my son's voice in words I would never forget. The key is understanding his vulnerabilities, Gregory said. He's not complicated, Brandon replied. The old man is lonely, afraid of dying alone. If we apply the right pressure, he'll sign anything. That's the weakness we exploit. Lonely. He'd called me lonely. As if the grief of losing Eleanor was a vulnerability to exploit, not a wound to respect. I sat motionless for 3 full minutes after the recording ended. Ray stood silent, waiting. Brandon hadn't just demanded money yesterday. He'd been planning this for months. The ultimatum, the erasure of the childhood promise, the threat to remove me from the guest list. All calculated, all designed to exploit the loneliness of a man who'd buried his wife and watched his son drift away. But he'd miscalculated. Loneliness isn't weakness. Loneliness is clarity. It's the absence of noise and distraction. It's the space where you can see exactly who people are without illusion. I picked up my phone and dialed Preston Whitfield. He answered on the first ring. Alvin. Preston, I said. I'm ready. 2 words. But they meant everything. 8 months of watching and waiting and wrestling with Russell's question about teaching versus losing. 8 months of documenting insults and signing my son's rent checks and building evidence, while trying to decide if I wanted revenge or reconciliation. Brandon had made the choice for me. I'll be there in an hour, Preston said. I hung up and looked out my window at the port of Tacoma, stretching below the cranes and containers and ships that represented 40 years of work. I'd built this from nothing. Started as a diesel mechanic and built an empire my son didn't know existed. My son thought I was lonely. He was right. My son thought that loneliness made me weak. He was wrong. The hesitation was over. The counterattack was about to begin, and Brandon had no idea his father had been preparing for this moment since September. Preston answered on the first ring. Said he'd be there in an hour. He arrived in 45 minutes. The most powerful weapons aren't built with steel or gunpowder. They're built with bank statements, email records, and the courage of someone who finally decides to tell the truth. Preston Whitfield was 55 with the steady demeanor of a man who'd spent decades protecting other people's secrets. He arrived at Coastal Logistics with his leather portfolio and 25 years of legal expertise in untangling family wealth disasters. I met him in the corporate conference room on the 14th floor, the one with windows overlooking the port. He opened his portfolio and spread documents across the mahogany table. Financial statements, tax liens, court filings, email printouts. 8 months of investigation compressed into paper evidence. Gregory Bennett. Preston began tapping the first page. 3 years unpaid taxes. $4 million in bank debt spread across 3 institutions, $2 million to private investors whose patience is running out. Total debt approaching $9 million. I looked at the numbers. They told the story of a man drowning, slowly maintaining appearances while the water rose above his head. The vacation home is mortgaged twice. The country club membership is paid with rotating credit cards. The charitable board positions, those are just stage dressing. He's been one bad quarter from collapse for 2 years. Preston slid another document across the table. But this is what you need to see. I recognized the format immediately. The contract Brandon had signed. The one Gregory had called a partnership agreement. The contract Brandon signed isn't a partnership agreement, Preston said quietly. It's a promissory note. Brandon Hayes owes Gregory Bennett $1.5 million and doesn't know it. I read the clause. Section 7, buried in legal language. Personal liability provision. Repayment terms. Default consequences. Brandon had signed his name 3 times without understanding that each signature was a promise to pay. He thought it was about my assets, I said. He thought he was stealing from you, Preston corrected. He didn't realize he was signing his own debt. I stood and walked to the window. Below, container ships moved through the port. 40 years I'd watched those ships build a business on the rhythm of their arrivals and departures. I can save him from that debt, I said. Preston was quiet for a moment. Then I know. But not yet. Not the right time. Sometimes the line between victim and villain runs right through the middle of a person my son was both, and I'd have to decide which half to save. What I learned later was that the same night Preston showed me those documents, Chloe Bennett discovered her own truth. She'd come home to her parents' house in Bellevue Estates. Brandon was there staying the night in a guest room. Late evening she walked past and saw Gregory through the half-open door. He was photographing documents from Brandon's wallet, while Brandon slept credit cards, driver's license, insurance information, taking pictures with his phone, systematic and quiet like he'd done it before. That was the final straw. Midnight. The house was silent. Chloe walked to her father's office. His computer was still on email program open. She knew his password. He'd never changed it from her childhood pet's name. She opened his sent folder and started reading. The email was dated 3 weeks earlier. Sent to someone named Marcus Westfield. Subject line asset coordination. She is the key to the safe, Gregory had written. Once the marriage contract is signed, we leverage her signature for the Westfield deal, Portland investors, and the Seattle commercial package. The old man's assets are just the first domino. Chloe sat motionless, the screen glowing in the dark office. She wasn't part of one scheme. She was collateral in all of them. Her signature, her marriage, her trust, all of it leveraged across multiple deals she'd never heard of, investors she'd never met. Contracts she hadn't signed but would be expected to. She plugged in a USB drive and started backing up every email. Westfield deal, Portland investors, Seattle commercial package, third-party coordination notes, financial projections that included her name like she was an asset, not a person. She set her phone to record the next time her mother called. Then she texted me. The message came at 1:17 a.m. Mr. Hayes, I need to talk to you. Alone. It's about my parents and Brandon. I have evidence. I stared at the message for 5 minutes before responding. Tomorrow. Neutral location. I'll text you the address. We met the next afternoon at a small cafe in Fremont, far from Tacoma, far from Bellevue neutral territory, where neither of our families would accidentally see us. Chloe arrived first. I recognized her through the window, 30 years old, and carrying weight she shouldn't have to carry. The kind of exhaustion that comes from learning your family isn't who you thought they were. I sat down across from her. She placed a USB drive on the table between us, smaller than my thumb, holding enough truth to detonate 3 families. I don't know who you really are, she said. I don't need to know. I only know my parents are doing something wrong, and I can't be part of it anymore. You were brave to text me, I said. Not many people would choose truth over family. My parents aren't family right now. They're strangers who raised me. I looked at the USB drive. What's on this? 8 months of emails, 3 recorded phone calls, documentation of at least 4 schemes using me as collateral. Plans to leverage my marriage into investment fraud. Everything. I picked up the drive. It felt heavier than it should. Are you sure? I asked. Once you do this, there's no going back. Your relationship with your parents. I'm sure, she said. I've been sure since I heard my mother say I'm the key to the safe. I'm not a key. I'm a person. I looked at this young woman who'd chosen truth over comfort exposure, over complicity. She reminded me of Eleanor, not in appearance but in moral clarity. The unwillingness to pretend even when pretending was easier. Thank you, I said. She stood to leave, then paused. Mr. Hayes, whatever you're planning, Brandon chose this, but I don't think he understands what he chose. He's in over his head. I know, I said. She left. I sat there holding the USB drive and with it the power to save my son from Gregory's trap, or let him face the consequences of his own greed. Chloe had given me a choice. I hadn't expected the evidence to destroy the Bennett family completely, and with it the knowledge that my son was both predator and prey. Russell's question from weeks ago suddenly had a third answer: teach, lose, or save. I left that cafe with Chloe's USB drive in my pocket, and the weight of 3 possible answers to Russell's question: teach, lose, or save. But before I could choose which one I needed to build the stage where the choice would matter. Building a counterattack requires 2 things: people who owe you loyalty, and the stomach to learn just how deep the betrayal goes. Tuesday afternoon, I sat in my office on the 14th floor and made a call I'd been planning since the moment Brandon handed me that wedding invoice. Margot Sinclair answered on the second ring. She was 45, running Ocean Crown Resort, with the confidence of someone who'd built something real from nothing. She knew immediately this wasn't a social conversation. Alvin, she said, it's been a while. Margot, I need your help with something at your resort. 2 seconds of silence. Processing. Then 20 years ago you gave me startup capital when every bank in Washington said no. You believed in me when no one else did. I will never forget that. What do you need? That was Margot. No hesitation, no questions about risk or inconvenience. Just immediate recognition that a debt of gratitude doesn't expire. My son is getting engaged, I said. They're planning a party at your resort next month. I need the venue to become something else for one evening. A place where truth gets told whether people want to hear it or not. What kind of truth? The kind that ends relationships. The kind that changes lives. The kind that needs witnesses. Another pause. Then you want control of the venue that night. Staff set up, timing, everything. Yes. Done. What else? I outlined what I needed. Sound system access. A private room for coordination. Staff who could be trusted to stay quiet about unusual requests. She listened without interrupting, and I could hear her taking notes. Marco, she said when I finished. Our VIP waiter. He's Tommy Ricci's nephew. Remember Tommy from the docks? I did. Tommy had worked the Tacoma waterfront with me 30 years ago. Good man, loyal. Marco's been with us 3 years. Solid, professional. He'll coordinate service that night, and I'll brief him personally. Anything you need, Marco will make it happen without questions. Thank you. Alvin, she said, and her voice softened. I don't know what your son did, but I know you. You don't build weapons unless someone forced your hand. Whatever you're planning, I trust it's for the right reasons. I hung up and stared out the window at the port below. Margot's loyalty came from gratitude. My son's betrayal came from calculation. The difference between those 2 things was the difference between humanity and commerce. 20 minutes later, Preston knocked on my door. He carried another folder. His expression told me this one was different. I went through Chloe's files more carefully, he said, sitting across from my desk. Found something you need to see. He opened the folder and pulled out a printed email. The header showed internal Bennett Company correspondence. Date, October 3rd. Just days before the coffee shop meeting where Brandon and Gregory had made their deal. Days before, I'd thought this scheme had started. This was in Chloe's files, Preston said. Internal email from Brandon to Gregory. September 15th, 2 weeks before their coffee shop meeting. He slid the paper across the desk. I read it. From Brandon Hayes to Gregory Bennett. Subject opportunity. Gregory, I've been thinking about what we discussed at the wedding venue tour. The old man has no one. Eleanor's been gone 6 years and he hasn't moved on. If we approach this correctly, he'll sign anything. That's the vulnerability. Let me know if you want to discuss specifics. Brandon, I read it twice, then a third time. September 15th, 2 weeks before Gregory made his offer. Brandon had been hunting me before Gregory ever showed up. This wasn't Gregory manipulating my son. This wasn't Brandon being slowly corrupted by wealthy in-laws. This was my son, unprompted, identifying his father's grief as an exploitable weakness and proposing a scheme to capitalize on it. Initiative, premeditation, calculation. He started it, I said. Preston nodded. Gregory provided the structure and the legal framework. But the idea, the targeting, the identification of vulnerability, that was Brandon. I stood and walked to the window. Below, container ships moved through the port. The same port where I'd worked as a mechanic 40 years ago, before Eleanor, before success, before I had anything to lose except my self-respect. I'd sent Brandon to live with Russell when Eleanor died. He was 29, supposedly an adult, but grief had torn him apart, and I couldn't hold myself together, let alone help him. Russell had a family stability, could give Brandon what I couldn't provide in that dark year. I'd thought I was doing the right thing, giving him space, letting him heal with people who weren't drowning. But maybe what I'd actually done was send him the message that when things got hard, his father disappeared. That loneliness was something to be ashamed of rather than worked through. That grief was a weakness rather than a wound. 5 minutes passed. Preston sat silent, letting me process. He was young when his mother died, I finally said. I sent him to live with Russell for almost a year. I was wrong from then on. Alvin, no, I interrupted. I'm not excusing what he's doing. I'm understanding where I failed him. There's a difference. I turned back to face Preston. He saw my loneliness and thought it was weakness, because I taught him that grief was something to hide from, not something to face together. He learned to weaponize emotion because I never showed him how to process it. That doesn't make what he's doing right, Preston said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But it makes it clear that teaching him a lesson isn't enough. Neither is losing him or saving him. What I need to do is show him who he could have been if either of us had done better. I stood at that window looking at the port, where I'd started with nothing, the city I'd helped build, the business my son worked for without knowing it was mine. He'd called me lonely as if it was a weapon to exploit. He was right about the loneliness. But what he didn't understand was that lonely people have nothing left to lose, and that makes them more dangerous than he could imagine. Preston gathered his papers. There's one more thing, he said, about Brandon's finances. Something I found that you need to understand before you decide how this ends. Preston had one more discovery to share about Brandon's finances. But before that, I needed to answer the question Russell had asked weeks ago, the one I'd been avoiding because I didn't know which answer was true. There comes a moment in every father's life when you stop trying to save your child and start trusting them to save themselves, even if that means watching them fall first. Late November evening, cold enough that my breath made clouds in the air, I walked across our adjoining yards to Russell's back porch. He was sitting in his usual chair, coffee gone cold in his hands like he'd been expecting me. Russell, I said. Sit. I sat. The porch boards creaked under my weight, familiar sounds from 40 years of neighbors. Brandon didn't just agree to Gregory's plan, I said. He initiated it. 2 weeks before Gregory even approached him with the scheme, he wrote an email, said I was lonely, that if they pressured me right, I'd sign anything. That was the vulnerability he identified, not wealth or assets or business. My grief over Eleanor. Russell set down his coffee cup. The sound of ceramic on wood was very loud in the quiet. He hunted you, Russell said. Yes. 5 full minutes passed. A car drove by on the street. Someone's dog barked 3 houses down. Normal sounds in a world that felt anything but normal. Finally, Russell spoke. Do you want to teach him a lesson or lose him forever? Because those two things aren't always the same thing. The same question he'd asked weeks ago. But this time I had an answer. I want him to see the truth, I said. Even if that truth shatters everything, even if it destroys our relationship, even if he never forgives me for showing him who he's become. Russell nodded slowly. That's love talking, not revenge. I don't know if there's a difference anymore. There's, Russell said. Revenge needs the other person to suffer. Love is willing to suffer yourself to give them truth. The difference between revenge and love is this: revenge needs the other person to suffer. Love is willing to suffer yourself to give them truth. Then do it, Russell said. But don't do it from anger. Do it because he needs to know. Do it because the boy who wrote that note at 8 years old deserves better than the man who wrote that email at 35. Do it because sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them see exactly what they've become. I looked across the yards at my house, the garage where I'd taught Brandon to use tools, the kitchen where Eleanor had made his favorite meals, the driveway where he'd learned to ride a bike. He was young when Eleanor died, I said. I sent him to live with you because I couldn't handle my own grief, let alone help him with his. Maybe that's where I lost him. Maybe that's when he learned that loneliness was weakness instead of just being human. You didn't lose him then, Russell said. You lost him when you never brought him back to learn accountability. When you let him think that being vulnerable was something to hide instead of something to work through. But Alvin, you can't fix that by protecting him now. You can only show him the truth and hope he chooses to grow from it. I stood to leave. Russell stood with me, hand on my shoulder. Whatever happens at that party, he said, remember you're doing this because you love him, even if he never understands that. Before I show you how I prepared for that revelation, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think exposing everything publicly was right, or B, if I should have stayed silent, and tell me why in just 5 to 10 words. Just know some details ahead are shaped for storytelling to convey the deeper lesson about truth and family. The next morning I sat in the conference room at Coastal Logistics with Preston on one side and Margot on speakerphone from Ocean Crown Resort. The legal documents are ready, Preston said, sliding a portfolio across the table. Evidence packages for each of Gregory's schemes, Bennett family debt documentation, Brandon's promissory note with clause analysis, Chloe's evidence files organized and indexed, everything you'll need. Party confirmed. Margot's voice came through the speaker. December 10th. 60 guests, business partners, social connections, investors. Everyone Gregory wants to impress will be watching. Marco has the staff coordinated. Sound system is yours. Private room for preparation is set aside. I looked at the documents spread across the table. 8 months of investigation compressed into evidence that would either wake my son up or lose him forever. I don't want to destroy Brandon, I said. I want him to see the truth. I'm Alvin, Preston said carefully. What if he refuses to wake up, refuses to learn? What if you show him all of this and he chooses Gregory's version of reality over yours? I was quiet for a long moment. Can you love someone and still let them fall? Can you be a father and refuse to catch them when they jump? That's his choice, I finally said. I can show him truth. I can present evidence. I can reveal what his in-laws have done and what he's become in the process. But I can't make him accept it. I can't force him to change or grow or choose differently. All I can do is give him the opportunity to see clearly. And if he refuses, Margot asked from the speaker, then at least he'll have seen the truth once. At least he'll know that someone loved him enough to risk everything to show it to him. What he does with that knowledge that's between him and the man he wants to become. Preston closed his portfolio. Margot confirmed the timeline through the speaker. December 10th, 3 weeks away. Everything was ready. The venue, the witnesses, the evidence, the revelation that would either wake my son up or lose him forever. I'd spent 8 months being patient. 8 months watching and documenting and building the case, while wrestling with Russell's question about teaching versus losing. 8 months of wondering if truth was worth the cost. Now patience was over and truth was coming whether any of us were ready for it. Preston stood to leave, then paused at the door. There's one more conversation you should have before that night. With who? The woman your son plans to marry. She gave you the evidence. She deserves to know what you're planning to do with it. Preston was right. Chloe deserved to know what I was planning to do with the evidence she'd given me. More than that, she deserved the chance to walk away if the cost was too high. The night before, you change everything, you find yourself talking to ghosts and making promises to people who can't answer, because sometimes the dead are the only ones who understand what the living are about to do. December 9th afternoon. I drove to the same cafe in Fremont where Chloe had first handed me that USB drive. Same table by the window. Chloe arrived 10 minutes early. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from weeks of carrying secrets that weigh more than they should. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "I owe you more than one meeting," I replied. We ordered coffee. Neither of us drank it. "What will you do at the party?" she asked. "What will you say?" "I'll tell the truth," I said. "That's all I can do. Your evidence, Preston's investigation, the recording of Brandon and Gregory, the contract Brandon signed without reading. All of it, in front of 60 witnesses." She nodded slowly. "I'll prepare my part. The recordings, the emails, everything I found." "Chloe," I said, and waited until she looked at me. "You could lose everything from this. Your family, your relationship with Brandon, your wedding plans, maybe your parents forever. Once this starts, there's no taking it back." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she met my eyes with clarity I'd never seen before. "I lost my family the moment I read that email, Mr. Hayes. I just didn't know it yet. What I'm losing tomorrow is the illusion that I ever had them. That's different. That's harder. But it's honest. Courage isn't doing what's right when everyone supports you. Courage is doing what's right when it costs you everyone." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand once. "You deserve more than everything they've given you." She bowed her head, said nothing. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her expression was resolved. "Will you be okay?" she asked. "After tomorrow, whether Brandon chooses to understand or not. I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'll be true, and that's more than I've been for a long time." She stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. "Thank you for not treating me like I'm fragile, for letting me be part of this. Thank you for being brave enough to seek it." She walked away carrying the weight of tomorrow on shoulders that shouldn't have to bear it. But she walked straight, and that mattered. I drove home as the December afternoon darkened into evening. The house was quiet, empty, the kind of empty that echoes when you close the door. I made coffee, turned on one lamp in the living room. The rest of the house stayed dark. Eleanor's photo sat on the side table where it had lived for 28 years. Community college graduation 46 years ago, before we were anything except two kids who thought love was enough. I sat in her chair, the reading chair by the window, and I told her everything. "I'm telling you this story one more time, honey, because tomorrow I tell it to everyone else." I recounted all of it, sending young Brandon to live with Russell after she died because I couldn't hold myself together. The 8 months of dinners where they called our neighborhood authentic and my work ethic precious. The recording where our son identified my grief as a vulnerability to exploit. The contract he signed thinking he was stealing from me. The party tomorrow where truth would either wake him up or lose him forever. "I don't know if I'm right," I said to her photograph, "but I know if I don't do it, I'll lose him in an even worse way. I'll lose him to the lie, to the man he's becoming, to the version of himself that sees love as transaction. How do you know if you're saving someone or losing them? How do you tell the difference between teaching and destroying?" The photo didn't answer. The house stayed quiet, but somehow sitting there in the dark with only one lamp burning, I felt something like peace. I stood and walked to the bedroom closet. In the back behind the flannel shirts I'd worn for 28 years hung a suit, dark navy, bought for Eleanor's funeral, worn exactly once. I took it out and held it up to the light. Still fit, still pressed, still waiting for the day I'd stop hiding. The flannel shirts had been a uniform, a costume, a way of telling the world I was just a mechanic, just a working man, just someone who didn't matter beyond honest day's work. Safe, invisible, unthreatening. But tomorrow wasn't about revealing wealth. Tomorrow was about refusing to be smaller than I was. about standing full height after years of stooping, about saying I am exactly who I am, and I will not apologize for it, or hide it, or make it easier for you to dismiss me. Tomorrow, for the first time in 28 years, I won't pretend any more, I said to the empty house. I hung the suit on the bedroom door where I'd see it first thing in the morning. Dark navy against white paint. Ready. I walked back to Eleanor's photo one more time. Wish me luck, honey. Or pray for me. Or just remember that I loved him enough to do this. The house didn't answer, but I didn't need it to. I turned off the lamp and went to bed. Tomorrow would begin early. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow 60 people would watch me stop being the man in the flannel shirt and start being the man I'd always been underneath. I slept better than I had in months. Woke before dawn to gray December light filtering through the bedroom window and the navy suit still hanging on the door where I'd left it. There are two kinds of mornings before everything changes. The ones where you wake up afraid, and the ones where you wake up knowing you've already made peace with what's coming. The phone rang at 6:30, Russell's name on the screen. "Mornin'," I said. "Do you remember what Dad used to say when we were little?" Russell's voice was quiet, thoughtful. When the other kids called us quiet, called us shy, I sat up in bed, phone pressed to my ear. Our father had died 15 years ago, but his voice was still there in my memory, clear as yesterday. "Silent people aren't weak," I said. "Silent people are waiting. You've waited long enough, brother." The line went quiet for a moment. Not awkward silence, understanding. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me. Just do what you came to do. And Alvin Dad would be proud. So would Eleanor." He hung up. I stood and walked to the closet, took down the navy suit. The fabric felt different in my hands than the flannel shirts I'd worn for 28 years. Heavier, more substantial, more honest. I showered, shaved carefully, dressed slowly, making sure everything fit right. The suit still fit perfectly, like it had been waiting as long as I had. In the bathroom mirror, I saw myself clearly for the first time in 8 months. Not the man in the flannel shirt who'd sat through dinner after dinner, letting them call him authentic and precious and brave. Not the man who nodded politely when they questioned his neighborhood and his work and his worth. Just a man who'd chosen silence strategically, who'd documented every insult, who'd built a counterattack brick by brick, while they thought he was too simple to understand what they were doing. Silent people aren't weak. Silent people are waiting. My brother had called to remind me of strength. What I didn't know yet was that my son was about to remind me of shame one more time. What I learned later from Chloe, from text message records, from the timeline that would be reconstructed after everything fell apart, was what happened that same morning in Brandon's apartment. He woke up confident, excited. This was his day, the engagement party where he'd cement his place in Gregory's world, where he'd show everyone the life he'd built, where he'd prove he was more than his father's son. He called Gregory at 8 a.m. "Everything's set for tonight," Brandon said, voice bright with anticipation. "The venue, the guests, the timing, it's all perfect." Chloe sat across from him on the couch, silent, watching, seeing him clearly maybe for the first time since she'd read that email calling her the key to the safe. Brandon didn't notice her expression, didn't see the distance in her eyes, didn't recognize that the woman sitting 3 feet away had already left him in every way that mattered. He finished the call with Gregory and picked up his phone, scrolled to my contact, started typing. My brother called to remind me of strength. My son texted to remind me of shame. The distance between those two calls was the distance between who I'd been and who I'd become. The text came through at 8:47 a.m. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone buzzed. "Dad, remember to be on time tonight, and please dress nicely. This is important." I stared at it for a full minute. Remember to be on time. As if I was the one who couldn't be trusted with punctuality. As if I was the one who'd spent 8 months avoiding phone calls and making excuses. Please dress nicely. As if the flannel shirts he'd criticized for 8 months were still all I owned. As if I needed his permission to present myself with dignity. This is important. As if his engagement party mattered more than the 35 years I'd spent raising him. As if the impression he made on Gregory's business associates outweighed the childhood promise he'd written in crayon. Back in his apartment, Brandon read the text twice before sending it. No hesitation, no second thought, no flicker of awareness that he was speaking to his father like he was an embarrassing obligation to be managed. He hit send and set the phone down on the coffee table. Chloe saw the message on the screen, saw those words, remember to be on time, and dress nicely, and this is important. Saw the casual cruelty Brandon didn't even recognize as cruelty anymore. She stood, picked up her purse. I need to go first, she said. I'll meet you there. Brandon barely looked up from his phone. Okay, see you tonight. Brandon had no idea his fiancée was leaving early to position herself against him. He had no idea about anything. He had no idea that Chloe would arrive at Ocean Crown Resort 3 hours early to coordinate with Margot and review evidence files with Preston. He had no idea that his father owned the building he'd been living in for 4 years. He had no idea that every piece of information Gregory had received about my finances had been carefully curated lies. He had no idea that the contract he'd signed made him personally liable for debts he couldn't pay. He had no idea that in 6 hours 60 witnesses would watch his entire world collapse in front of the people he most wanted to impress. I read Brandon's text one more time, remember to be on time and dress nicely, then deleted it without responding. I'd spent 8 months being the man he wanted me to be. Small, embarrassed, apologetic, grateful for scraps of attention and inclusion. 8 months of nodding politely while they dissected my neighborhood and my work and my worth. 8 months of sitting 3 feet farther from my son at every dinner while he grew more comfortable with my humiliation. Tonight, in front of 60 witnesses at Ocean Crown Resort, I'd show him the man I actually was. And he'd have no idea until it was too late. I finished my coffee, checked my watch. 2-hour drive to the San Juan Islands. Party started at 6. I'd arrive at 5:30, late enough that guests would be arriving early enough to coordinate final details with Marco. I locked the house and got in my truck. The navy suit felt right. The silence felt right. The clarity felt right. Silent people aren't weak. Silent people are waiting, and I'd waited long enough. The drive took 2 hours. Ferried to San Juan Island, winding roads through forests, the kind of scenery that would have been beautiful if I'd been paying attention. But I was rehearsing what I'd say when the time came. Every great performance needs 3 things: a stage, an audience, and actors who don't know they're in a play. Ocean Crown Resort appeared around the final curve like something out of a magazine. Glass and stone and elegance perched on the northern tip of the island. The circular drive was full of expensive cars, Mercedes, BMWs, Lexus sedans announcing their owner's net worth. I pulled my 1998 Honda into the valet circle behind a silver Tesla. The young valet approached with professional composure. His eyes flicked from my truck to my suit to my face, and something shifted in his expression, not contempt, recognition. He took my keys with a knowing nod. "Welcome to Ocean Crown, sir," he said, and the sir carried weight it hadn't carried at any Bennett dinner. Inside the lobby was all high ceilings and chandeliers. Through the open ballroom doors, I could see the party taking shape. 60 people, maybe more. Elegant cocktail attire, waiters circulating with champagne, the soft hum of conversation. The entire Bennett social world assembled in one room. Margot stood near the entrance clipboard, in hand. Our eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. She gave the smallest nod, allies positioned, everything ready, then turned back to her conversation. Across the ballroom, a waiter in formal attire caught my attention. Marco Tommy Ricci's nephew, who'd worked at Ocean Crown Resort for 3 years, was arranging glasses on a VIP table. His eyes found mine, and he gave a subtle nod of confirmation. Everything was ready. I stepped into the ballroom. Conversations didn't stop, but I felt eyes turning. The man in the navy suit who didn't quite fit. Brandon's father. The mechanic. The obligation. Brandon saw me from across the room. For just a moment, less than a second, worry crossed his face. Something about the suit instead of flannel. Something about how I carried myself. Then the worry disappeared, replaced by that flat, transactional expression I'd learned to recognize. He approached. "Dad, you're here. Good." "Not I'm glad you came." "Not you look nice." Just you're here good. Wouldn't miss it for anything, I said. 60 witnesses. 60 people who came to watch an engagement celebration and would leave having seen something else entirely. Brandon nodded and turned back to his conversation, dismissing me as efficiently as he'd greeted me. I watched him go, memorizing the confidence in his posture, the ease with which he moved through this crowd. Cocktail hour officially began. Waiters moved through the room with practiced efficiency. Marco caught my eye once more as he passed with champagne, the slightest tilt of his head toward the sound system controls, everything in position. Gregory appeared at my elbow, all warmth and practiced charm, steering me toward a small group near the entrance. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Alvin Hayes, Brandon's father. His voice carried that particular tone of magnanimous inclusion. Retired diesel mechanic. Down-to-earth man. We're so fortunate to have him joining our family. Retired diesel mechanic. Down-to-earth. Fortunate to have him. Each phrase a small knife wrapped in velvet. The final polite insult delivered to the first witnesses. I smiled, nodded to each person in the circle, memorized their faces, these people who would remember this moment very differently in an hour. Thank you for having me, I said. Vivian drifted past, champagne in hand, trailing a friend from her charity board. She glanced at me, then leaned toward her companion, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. That suit looks like it was rented from a street wedding shop, she said. Bless his heart, he tried. The woman next to her tittered softly. 8 months of smiling through insults. Tonight, the smiling stopped. I turned, looked directly at Vivian, not with the humble nod she'd come to expect, not with the apologetic smile that said I knew I didn't belong, not with any of the deference they'd trained me to perform. Just looked. Vivian's smile faltered, just a fraction, just enough that I saw the flicker of uncertainty cross her face. Something had changed, and she'd felt it, even if she couldn't identify what. Her friend noticed, too, the way I looked without apologizing, without shrinking, without any of the social signals that confirmed their assessment of me. Well, Vivian said, recovering her smile, but not quite getting it back to full brightness. Shall we find our seats? They moved away, but Vivian glanced back once, still trying to figure out what had shifted. Around the ballroom, other guests were starting to notice, too. The man in the navy suit who'd arrived in a Honda, but carried himself like he owned the place. The father, Brandon, had kept carefully peripheral, suddenly standing dead center in everyone's field of vision. Something had changed in the air, and the people who'd spent 8 months treating me like background scenery were starting to realize I'd become the center of attention, but they had no idea why. Gregory was calling people toward their seats. The formal program would begin soon. Speeches, toasts, Brandon's moment in the spotlight. I found my assigned seat table 7 near the back, appropriately distant from the head table where Brandon and Chloe would sit with Gregory and Vivian. The geography of worth expressed in floor plan. I sat down. Marco materialized at my shoulder with water. 10 minutes, sir, he murmured, barely audible. I nodded. Across the ballroom, Margot was dimming the main lights, bringing up the spots on the head table. Brandon was standing, reaching for the microphone, champagne glass in hand, looking confident and happy. He thought he knew what came next. He thought this was his moment, his party, his carefully orchestrated performance of success. He had no idea that in exactly 10 minutes, his father would stop being a character in his story and become the narrator of an entirely different one. 10 minutes passed in a blur of final preparations, guests finding their seats, the lights dimming. Brandon standing, reaching for the microphone. Brandon stood at the microphone champagne glass, raised ready to deliver the speech that would crown his perfect evening, unaware that the man in the navy suit, standing at the room's edge, had spent 8 months building this exact moment. Thank you all for coming tonight. Brandon began, his voice confident, comfortable. Chloe and I are honored to celebrate with family and friends who've supported us on this journey. Polite applause. Champagne glasses lifted. 60 faces turned toward the head table, toward the young couple, toward the celebration. I especially want to thank Gregory and Vivian for their guidance, Brandon continued, for showing me what success really looks like, what it means to build something significant. More applause. Gregory nodding with satisfaction. Then Brandon's eyes found me at table 7. And of course I want to thank my father for trying his best to contribute to tonight. It's never too late to learn what real business looks like. Polite laughter rippled through the Bennett side of the room. Understanding smiles. The joke everyone was in on except the man it was about. I watched my son bask in applause he hadn't earned, supported by money he didn't have in a building he didn't know belonged to me. The performance was almost over. Gregory leaned toward an investor at his table, voice pitched just loud enough. The old man's learning his place finally. I set down my champagne glass. The sound of crystal on tablecloth was very loud in my ears. I stood. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Brandon paused mid-sentence, champagne glass still raised confusion flickering across his face, as his father walked slowly toward the center of the ballroom. Brandon, I said quietly, my voice carrying in the sudden hush, I think it's time we cleared up a few misunderstandings. I let Brandon finish his speech. Every word he spoke added weight to the scales that were about to tip. The side entrance opened. Margot stepped through professional and composed clipboard, replaced with a single folder. Her voice rang clear across the ballroom. Chairman Hayes, Mr. Whitfield, has the documents you requested. Chairman Hayes. 60 faces turned from me to Margot, confusion spreading like ripples in water. Brandon's champagne glass lowered slowly. Preston Whitfield entered behind Margot, leather briefcase in hand, the steady presence of a man who'd spent decades delivering uncomfortable truths to powerful people. He walked to the podium, set down his briefcase, and faced the room. Good evening, he said. For those who don't know me, I'm Preston Whitfield, estate attorney for the Eleanor Hayes Family Trust. The trust controls Coastal Logistics Group and the Ocean Crown Resort Chain. Total value $300 million. The founder and sole beneficiary is standing right here, Alvin Hayes. Silence. Not the polite silence of attention, the shocked silence of people trying to recalculate reality in real time. The chandeliers above the ballroom cast perfect light on 60 faces, turning from celebration to confusion to horror, like watching a spotlight move from actors to an audience that didn't know they'd become part of the performance. I watched the color drain from Brandon's face as Preston spoke. 8 months of patience, and now every debt, every lie, every condescending word was being weighed on a scale he'd never known existed. Preston continued, his voice steady, factual, devastating. The Bennett family currently owes $9 million through various channels my office has been tracking. Bank debt, tax, liens, private investor obligations. The documentation is available for legal review. Gregory's face went from confident to pale in the span of 2 seconds. Vivian's frozen smile cracked at the edges. I conditionally ER'd. EQ E-tune, Preston said, pulling a document from his briefcase. The contract that Brandon Hayes signed 3 weeks ago, the one presented as a partnership agreement, is actually a promissory note. Personal liability for $1.5 million due in full, January 15th, 2023. Brandon turned to Gregory. Gregory wouldn't meet his eyes. The ballroom held its breath. Then Chloe stood. She'd been sitting at the head table, silent through Brandon's speech, silent through Preston's revelation. Now she walked to the podium with a tablet in her hands, and a calm that looked like the eye of a hurricane. Since we're revealing truths tonight, she said, her voice steady through the microphone, here's mine. She tapped the tablet. The projection screen behind the head table illuminated. Email headers, Bennett investor accounts, subject lines that made people lean forward to read. These emails are from Bennett investor accounts, discussing me as the key to the safe. Insurance policy for Hayes assets, they wrote. Once the marriage happens, leverage her access. Vivian's frozen smile shattered completely. Chloe's voice through the microphone was steady, measured, almost clinical, but I saw her left hand trembling as she touched the tablet screen, advancing to the next piece of evidence that would end her engagement and expose the family she'd almost married into. And this, Chloe said, pressing play, is my mother explaining the plan to a business associate last month. Vivian's recorded voice filled the ballroom, tinny through speakers, but unmistakably hers. Once the girl marries in, we have social security assets. Brandon keeps her close. We get access to whatever the old man's been hiding. She's the key. Chloe's voice was steady, but I saw what it cost her every word, a door closing on the life she'd imagined. She wasn't just rejecting Brandon. She was rejecting being anyone's leverage. She turned off the playback, looked directly at Brandon, removed the engagement ring from her left hand with the kind of finality that doesn't need explanation. She set it on the podium, small circle of diamond and gold catching the chandelier light. Brandon didn't choose love, she said. He chose money and shame over his father. I choose to walk away from both. She walked toward the ballroom exit. 60 pairs of eyes followed her. The doors closed behind her with a quiet click that sounded like punctuation. The engagement ring sat on the podium under the lights, a small circle of diamond and gold that had promised forever but delivered betrayal. Brandon stared at it, then at Gregory, then at me, and I saw the exact moment he understood that everything he'd built in 8 months was built on land I owned. The question wasn't whether it would collapse. The question was what he'd do when it finished falling. The ballroom felt frozen. Chloe's footsteps echoed as she walked toward the exit, and the small diamond ring sat on the podium like a monument to everything that had just collapsed. Brandon stood at the microphone, his face pale, staring at that tiny circle of metal and stone. I reached into my breast pocket and felt the small square of paper I'd been carrying for 8 months, the one piece of evidence that had nothing to do with money. The note was yellowed at the edges. The crayon lines faded, but still legible. Brandon had written it when he was 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table while Eleanor made dinner. Dad, when I get married, remember to walk me down the aisle. I'd found it in a box of Eleanor's things after she passed. For months it had sat in my drawer at the Riverside apartment. Then I'd started carrying it, a reminder of who my son had been before ambition rewrote him. I walked across the ballroom floor. Guests parted silently, their champagne glasses frozen. Preston and Margot stood near the projection screen, watching. Chloe had stopped at the doorway, her hand on the frame, looking back. Brandon turned as I approached. His eyes were red, his jaw tight. Dad, I have something for you. I pulled out the note and unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled in the silence. Do you remember writing this? He stared at the crayon letters. Something shifted in his expression, recognition maybe, or pain. I was a kid. You were my son. I held it out to him. This is the last thing I'm giving you, Brandon. The last piece of the man you promised to be. He took it with shaking hands. His thumb traced over the word, promise. I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. You broke every promise you made to that 7-year-old boy who loved his father. I hope it was worth it. I stepped back before he could respond. The room was watching hundreds of eyes on us, but all I could see was the child Brandon had been and the stranger he'd become. Sir, Margot appeared at my elbow. The car's ready. I nodded and turned toward the exit. Behind me, I heard Vivian Bennett's voice crack through the silence. Brandon, say something, fix this. But there was nothing to fix. Not tonight. The parking lot was cold December wind cutting through my suit jacket. Margot walked beside me in silence, her heels clicking on the asphalt. The sedan was parked under a streetlight, Preston already behind the wheel. That was brutal, Margot said quietly. Are you okay? I didn't answer right away. She opened the rear door for me. I thought it would feel different. Different how? Like winning. I climbed into the back seat. The leather was cold. It just feels empty. Margot slid in beside me and Preston pulled out of the parking lot. Through the rear window, I could see the resort's glass facade blazing with light. The Ocean Crown Resort, one of the properties Eleanor and I had built together, now the stage for everything I'd destroyed tonight. My phone buzzed. I pulled it out and saw Brandon's name on the screen. Brandon, Dad, please. Brandon, can we talk? Brandon, I'm sorry. 3 messages in 30 seconds. I watched the dots appear as he typed something else. You going to answer? Preston glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I silenced the phone and slid it back into my pocket. No, he's your son, Margot said softly. He stopped being my son when he cashed that check and called me a failure. I looked out the window at the dark highway. Tonight he learned what failure actually costs, but the words tasted bitter. I'd spent 8 months planning this, every detail choreographed for maximum devastation. Preston's presentation, Chloe's evidence, the childhood note. I'd wanted Brandon to feel exactly what I'd felt that morning in his office, small, worthless, invisible. Now I just felt tired. Where to? Preston asked. Riverside apartment. The place Brandon had called a hovel. The place where I'd rebuilt myself into something he never saw coming. Margot was typing on her tablet. The board meeting is Wednesday. Whitfield and Associates will present the documentation formally, and Chloe asked me to tell you she said thank you. I nodded. Chloe Bennett had walked out of that ballroom with more dignity than anyone else in the building. She'd taken off the ring, presented evidence of her own humiliation, and left without looking back. My phone buzzed again and again. Brandon, I'll fix this. Brandon, just give me a chance. Brandon, Dad, please don't do this. I turned the phone face down on the seat. You know he's going to keep trying, Margot said. Vivian will push him. The Bennetts aren't going to accept this. Let them try. I closed my eyes. Preston documented everything. The trust is airtight. The promissory note is legally binding. Brandon signed his name to a debt he can't pay. That's not what I mean. Margot's voice was gentle. I mean, Brandon is going to call text, show up at your door. He's not going to disappear. I opened my eyes and looked at her. If he shows up, I won't answer the door. And if he keeps coming back, I thought about the childhood note probably crumpled in Brandon's pocket right now. That 7-year-old boy with the crayon and the promises he couldn't keep. Then he'll learn what I learned, I said. That some doors close and don't reopen. That some promises once broken can't be fixed. The highway stretched dark ahead, taking me back to the Riverside apartment. To the quiet rooms where I'd spent 8 months becoming invisible, building an empire Brandon never knew existed. I'd won tonight. Every piece had fallen exactly where I'd placed it. So why did it feel like I'd lost something I couldn't get back? 3 days after the party, Margot forwarded me an email with no comment, just a subject line that read, Haysby employment status change, and an HR timestamp from that morning. I opened it at the Riverside apartment coffee going cold beside my laptop. The message was from Diana Foster, 52 HR Director at Coastal Development Corporation, one of the mid-sized firms in my portfolio that Brandon had never connected to me. Her words had the careful precision of corporate legal review. Effective immediately, you're placed on paid administrative leave pending investigation into undisclosed familial conflicts of interest within corporate structure. You will receive full compensation during this period. Please return your building access card to security by 5 p.m. today. I read it twice. December 13th, 2022. 3 days since I'd handed Brandon that childhood note and walked out. My phone buzzed. Another voicemail from Brandon the 7th since Saturday. I played it on speaker. Dad. His voice sounded hollow, scraped raw. Diana Foster just... She said conflict of interest. Familial corporate structure. I looked it up. Coastal Development is owned by a holding company, which is owned by... Dad, you own the company. You own my job. Did you own everything the whole time? The message ended. I sat there listening to the silence that followed. He's starting to understand, Margot said from the doorway. The ecosystem, I said quietly. That was the thing nobody talked about when you controlled $300 million in assets. It wasn't just buildings and bank accounts. It was systems, employment networks, credit agencies, property management firms, banking relationships. Brandon's apartment complex was managed by a group that contracted with one of my subsidiaries. His car loan came from a bank where Eleanor Hayes Family Trust held significant bonds. His job reported to a board I'd appointed. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I just stopped protecting him from the architecture he'd been standing on all along. Russell called twice yesterday, Margot said. You gonna answer... I thought about Brandon at that podium holding a childhood promise written in crayon. I thought about driving away while his texts piled up. Not yet, I said. 2 weeks passed like falling dominoes. On Christmas Eve, Brandon received a letter from his apartment complex, 60-day notice of lease non-renewal, perfectly legal. The same day, his bank requested employment verification for his car loan, given recent changes to your financial profile. I learned about his call to Russell from Russell himself, who phoned me that evening. Brandon called me tonight, Russell said without preamble. He said, Uncle Russell, I need... And then his voice just broke. What exactly do you want from my family? Alvin, I didn't want anything, Russell. I just stopped pretending I had nothing. Chloe won't return Vivian's calls. Gregory's facing investigation. And now Brandon's losing everything. Russell's breath crackled over the line. Where does this end? I didn't have an answer. The question sat between us like a weight. He's your nephew, I said finally. He's your son, Russell hung up. Watching someone lose everything feels different when you're the reason gravity suddenly remembered to pull. You don't celebrate. You just stand there counting what falls. December 31st, 2022. Preston called at 9 a.m. with news that should have felt like vindication. IRS opened formal investigation into the Bennett family's tax filings, he said. Gregory's lawyer is scrambling. The investor deal that was going to cover their debt collapsed completely after Chloe's evidence went public. And Vivian lost 3 charity board positions. The leaked audio made the rounds fast. Gregory's blaming her for letting Chloe overhear anything. She's blaming him for owing $9 million in the first place. Preston paused. Daniel Crawford, the Bennett's corporate attorney, overheard them arguing in Gregory's office yesterday. Gregory said, I told you not to let her hear that conversation. Now she's gone, and we're facing investigation. Vivian shot back. You're the one who owed $9 million, Gregory. Don't put this on me. Former allies blaming each other in ruin. What about Chloe? I asked. That's the interesting part. Preston's tone shifted. Nobody knows. Vivian's been calling her for 3 weeks, straight to voicemail. Gregory hired a PI to locate her. She's not at her apartment, not with friends. 1 large bank withdrawal, then nothing. She's just gone. I thought about Chloe walking out of that ballroom, her engagement ring abandoned on the podium, evidence of her own humiliation delivered with perfect calm before she disappeared onto the December night. She destroyed them and removed herself from the aftermath, I said. Smart woman, Preston agreed. Preston's report sat on my desk beside Brandon's voicemails I hadn't returned, and Russell's question I couldn't answer. Where does this end? New Year's Eve. I sat in the Riverside apartment watching the city through windows Brandon had once called hovel views. The Bennetts were tearing each other apart in their lawyer's office. Brandon was losing his apartment. Chloe had vanished entirely. I'd spent 8 months building this collapse. 8 months researching, documenting, positioning every piece. 8 months becoming invisible while I constructed an empire Brandon never saw. 8 months planning. The perfect revelation, Preston's presentation, Chloe's evidence, that childhood note with its crayon promises. And now it was happening in real time. Everyone falling exactly as I'd designed. Everyone except the one person I actually wanted to reach. My phone sat on the table, dark and silent. 17 unread voicemails from Brandon. 4 missed calls from Russell. The timestamps told their own story. December 10th, 11:47 p.m. December 11th, 2:33 a.m. December 13th, 8:42 a.m. December 24th, 10:15 p.m. Each one shorter than the last, his voice getting quieter. The last one was from this morning. 6 words. Dad, please, I'm sorry, please. I set the phone down. Outside, the city prepared for midnight for fireworks and champagne and the promise that New Year's brought new beginnings. I'd won. The Bennetts were ruined. Brandon understood exactly how much he'd underestimated me. Chloe had escaped with her dignity, intact. So why did it still feel like I'd lost something I couldn't name? Chloe sat across from me at the same cafe where we'd met twice before, but this time her hands weren't steady. And her eyes weren't asking for information, they were asking for forgiveness. January 10th, 2023. 10 days into the new year, and Brandon's 17th voicemail still sat unanswered on my phone. But Chloe had sent a single text. Can we talk? Same place. I'd said yes. She wore a gray sweater and no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back, simply no engagement ring, no designer accessories. She looked younger without all the polish, or maybe just more honest. Thank you for meeting me, she said. Her coffee sat untouched between us. I wasn't sure you would. You walked out of that ballroom with more dignity than anyone else in the building, I said. Why wouldn't I? She looked down at her hands. Because I was part of it. The first few months when Brandon introduced us, I believed what my parents said about you. I thought you were bitter, washed up, clinging to past glory. Her voice dropped. I disrespected you in ways I'm ashamed of now. I remember those early months. Chloe's polite distance at family dinners. The way she'd change subjects when I spoke about Eleanor, or the early years building coastal logistics. Small dismissals that added up to invisibility. You don't need to apologize for being deceived, Chloe, I said carefully. Only if you knew the truth and remained silent. You didn't remain silent. She looked up, her eyes shining. But I should have seen it sooner. I should have questioned why Brandon never visited you. Why your name never came up except in dismissal. I should have... You exposed it when you learned the truth. I interrupted gently. That's what matters. Not how quickly you saw through the deception, but what you did when you finally did. The cafe hummed around us, espresso machines, hissing quiet conversations blending into white noise. Through the window, January rain streaked the glass. Chloe was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question I'd been expecting. Will you forgive Brandon? I thought about 17 voicemails, about that childhood note with its crayon promises, about the stranger my son had become and the man I'd raised him to be. I don't know yet, I said finally, but I won't pretend to forgive until I'm ready. That wouldn't be fair to either of us. That's honest. It's all I have right now. I leaned forward slightly. What about you? What happens next for Chloe Bennett? She smiled small and determined. Rebuild. I gave back everything my parents bought with borrowed money. The apartment, the car, all of it. I'm staying with a friend from college waitressing at night, looking for work that I earn. She met my eyes. I want to rebuild with my own hands. No one needs to open doors for me. That's the correct answer, I said. How do you forgive someone who broke your trust? When you're still learning whether winning back your dignity means losing your son forever. I'd won the war, but couldn't tell if the casualties included everything I'd been fighting for in the first place. Chloe reached across the table and squeezed my hand once briefly. Thank you for not closing every door. Brandon doesn't deserve your forgiveness yet. Maybe he never will. But thank you for being honest about it instead of pretending. She stood, pulled on her coat, and walked out into the January rain. I watched her disappear down the sidewalk, shoulders straight, rebuilding herself one step at a time. My phone buzzed. Brandon's 18th voicemail. I silenced it and finished my coffee. 6 weeks after the party, I sat in Preston's office signing documents that had nothing to do with revenge. The Eleanor Hayes Scholarship Fund. $5 million from the trust awarded annually to first-generation students pursuing business degrees. Named after the woman who'd built coastal logistics with me in those early years before cancer took her, before Brandon forgot where his family's foundation came from. Preston reviewed the final draft, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Everything's in order. Board approved it unanimously. The announcement goes out next week. He looked up. Why establish this now after everything? I thought about Eleanor working beside me in that first cramped office, balancing ledgers by hand while pregnant with Brandon. I thought about her insisting we build something that mattered, not just something that made money. Because Eleanor built this corporation with me in the early years before she passed away, I said, this asset is not just mine, it was ours. She deserved to be remembered for what she built, not just as Brandon's mother or my late wife. Preston nodded slowly. She'd be proud of this. I hope so. He slid the signature page across his desk. I signed my name beside Eleanor's Eleanor Hayes Family Trust, establishing the Eleanor Hayes Scholarship Fund. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Eleanor's name at the top of the scholarship document looked right in a way that revenge never had, building something instead of tearing everything down. Preston gathered the signed pages, then paused. The announcement draft has space for the first recipient's name. Should I follow up with the selection committee? I looked at the draft he'd printed. There it was, Eleanor Hayes Scholarship Fund first annual recipient, and then a blank line waiting to be filled. Leave it blank, I said. Preston's eyebrows rose. blank. The selection committee has 3 qualified candidates ready for review. We could announce the first recipient alongside the fund itself. Strong PR impact. I know. I tapped the blank line with one finger. Leave it blank anyway. No need to rush it this year. Preston studied my face for a moment, then nodded. He didn't ask why. Maybe he understood, or maybe he just knew better than to push. The truth was simple. I wasn't ready to decide who deserved Eleanor's legacy yet. Brandon had thrown away his own inheritance through greed and betrayal. Chloe was rebuilding with her own hands, refusing doors she hadn't earned. And I was still learning the difference between justice and revenge, between winning and actually healing. Some decisions needed time more than efficiency. Some blank spaces needed to stay empty until you were ready to fill them honestly. Preston nodded and filed the signed documents, the scholarship fund now official, with its first recipient, still unnamed. I didn't tell him why I left it blank, or who I was leaving space for, or whether I'd ever fill it. Some questions need time more than answers. The footsteps on the gravel driveway stopped just outside the garage door, and I knew without looking up from the engine block who'd finally come home. December 10th, 2023. 1 year to the day since I'd stood at that podium and handed Brandon a childhood note written in crayon. 1 year since Chloe had walked out with her engagement ring abandoned, and Preston had revealed the empire Brandon never knew existed. I kept my hands on the wrench, adjusting the manifold bolt. The garage smelled like motor oil and old concrete, the same smell that had filled this space since I'd bought the property 40 years ago. Some things don't change just because everything else does. Dad, Brandon's voice was quieter than I remembered, rougher around the edges. I straightened slowly, my back protesting the movement. 68 years old, and engines still made more sense to me than most people. I turned. Brandon stood in the doorway, backlit by winter afternoon sun. He looked thinner. His coat was worn at the elbows, his shoes scuffed. No designer watch, no leather briefcase. His hair needed cutting, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. Brandon. We looked at each other across 10 feet of concrete floor and a year of silence. 18 unanswered voicemails. A scholarship fund with a blank recipient line. A question Russell had asked that I'd never answered. Where does this end? I didn't come to ask for money, Brandon said. His hands were in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. I came to ask for a chance to start over. I set down the wrench. It hit the workbench with a metallic ring that echoed in the silence. Why? Because I spent a year losing everything and learning what actually matters. He took a half step forward, then stopped. I worked at construction for 6 months. Moved furniture after that. Shared a studio apartment with 2 other guys. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The Bennett family stopped returning my calls after the IRS finished with them. Vivian blamed me for Chloe leaving. Gregory said I'd destroyed their reputation. And your mother's family? Uncle Russell helped me get the furniture job. He's the only one who didn't turn his back. Brandon's jaw tightened. But he made it clear I earned the paycheck he just made the introduction. No favors, no shortcuts. I nodded slowly. Russell had never told me that, but it sounded like him helping his nephew without rescuing him from consequences. So why come back now? I asked. After a year, Brandon met my eyes. Do you know where I went wrong? The question caught me off guard. Not an excuse, not a justification, a genuine question. You tell me, I said. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car passed on the street, tires hissing on damp pavement. Inside the garage, the smell of oil hung heavy and familiar. I let others convince me you were a burden, Brandon said finally. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Vivian, Gregory, even some of my colleagues, they all said you were stuck in the past, that you couldn't adapt, that you were, diminished. And I believed them because it was easier than admitting the truth, which was that you're not a burden. Brandon's hands came out of his pockets. You're the only real support I ever had. Mom built a corporation with you. You raised me. You taught me everything I actually know about work that matters. And I threw it away because I wanted to look successful more than I wanted to be decent. A year ago, I'd torn down everything Brandon built on lies. Today he was standing in my garage, admitting he'd built on sand, and the recognition came from his own experience of falling, not from my explanations or my revenge. "What do you want from me?" I asked quietly. "Nothing you're not ready to give." He shook his head. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect money or position or doors to open. I wanted you to know I understand now. What I threw away, what you tried to show me." I looked at him, this man who was my son, who'd called me worthless, and cashed a check while my wife's memory was still fresh in both our minds. This man who'd spent a year losing apartments and jobs and learning what I'd tried to teach him before greed got louder than memory. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you flipped. It was something you built slowly, bolt by bolt, choosing reconstruction over continued resentment. I picked up the wrench I'd set down, turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the solid reality of metal and purpose. "Come here," I said. Brandon crossed the garage floor. He moved carefully, like he wasn't sure the ground would hold. I held out the wrench. "Take this." He took it, his fingers wrapping around the handle where mine had been. His hands were calloused now, working hands, not the soft palms of a corporate manager who'd never built anything real. "That bolt," I pointed at the manifold, "needs another quarter turn. Not too tight or you'll strip it." Brandon bent over the engine. The wrench clinked against metal. He adjusted his grip, applied pressure carefully. The bolt turned. "Like that. Good. Now hand me the socket set." He passed me the tools. I positioned the socket, and we worked. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of wrench sounds and shared focus, the kind of quiet you can only reach after surviving the loud collapse. No apologies exchanged, no declarations of forgiveness or reconciliation, just an engine that needed fixing and two people who destroyed each other, now choosing to build something smaller, but real. "This gasket," I said after a while, "needs replacing before we can start her up." "I can pick one up tomorrow," Brandon offered, "if you want help finishing the job." I looked at him across the engine block. His face was smudged with grease, his worn coat sleeves pushed up past his elbows. He looked more like the boy I'd raised than the stranger who'd stood in that office and called me a burden. "Tomorrow works," I said. We worked together as the afternoon light slanted through the garage door, two people who'd destroyed, and been destroyed now, rebuilding something smaller, but real. The engine wouldn't start today, maybe not tomorrow, but we had time, and for the first time in a year, that felt like enough. And to you listening to my story, remember, this winning isn't always what it looks like from the outside. I spent 8 months planning the perfect revenge against my own son. I documented every betrayal, built my case, and revealed it all in the most devastating way possible. I won completely and felt emptier than I'd ever been. Don't make my mistake of thinking that exposing someone's wrongs will heal your own wounds. It won't. The real work begins after the revenge is done. What I learned through this dad revenge family story is that silence serves truth, but only when it waits until someone is ready to hear it. My family betrayal revenge was perfect in execution but hollow in result. The real victory came months later, in a garage, passing a wrench to my son without grand declarations. I believe God put me through this journey, not to teach me how to win, but to show me that some relationships require destruction before they can be rebuilt honestly. Family betrayal revenge doesn't heal family patience and truth do. If this dad revenge family story made you think, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between revenge and reconciliation? What would you have done differently? Share this with someone who needs it and subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge. For more stories like this dad, revenge family journey about fathers, families, and the roads to forgiveness. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. A final reminder, certain details in this story have been fictionalized for dramatic impact and to better illustrate the lesson. The emotional truth, the cost of family betrayal, revenge, and the long road to healing, that's what I hope stays with you.